Everyone, my dear viewers. In this video, American tourists collide with cultures that don't argue emotion, don't explain endlessly, and don't reorganize themselves around individual demands.
The silence inside the Copenhagen bakery disappeared when the American businessman slapped the counter twice, demanding oat milk substitutions immediately afterward there publicly. He smiled confidently while waving his platinum credit card toward exhausted employees nearby, somehow emotionally. The cashier answered calmly, "We already prepared the menu this morning." He laughed automatically. "Then prepare flexibility too." Nobody behind him looked impressed afterward professionally. The cashier pointed toward handwritten signs explaining breakfast combinations remained fixed until noon every weekday there publicly. The American scanned them dramatically before grinning like discovery itself created negotiation rights automatically, somehow emotionally. "Rules should help customers," he explained loudly. A woman beside me finally whispered, "Here rules help mornings survive Americans." Several nearby customers nearly inhaled croissants accidentally afterward there professionally. The businessman kept pushing afterward publicly emotionally somehow. "I'm paying premium prices," he argued carefully while tapping the display glass impatiently. The cashier nodded once. "Yes, for existing food." That sentence landed harder than anybody expected naturally. Suddenly the American stopped smiling completely afterward there. Copenhagen didn't reject him emotionally. It simply continued operating without rearranging itself around his appetite, professionally speaking. That's the strange thing Americans notice across Europe eventually afterward publicly, somehow emotionally. Nobody argues aggressively. Nobody performs authority dramatically. Systems simply continue existing whether tourists emotionally approve or not, professionally speaking. Americans often mistake calmness for flexibility automatically. Europeans frequently use calmness instead as reinforced concrete socially afterward there. Silence becomes the wall confidence eventually crashes against publicly. I once watched an American influencer enter a quiet bookstore in Prague carrying a portable speaker afterward there publicly somehow. Jazz music echoed softly through philosophy shelves while she filmed European aesthetic content, emotionally speaking professionally. An employee approached carefully asking whether she could lower the volume slightly. The influencer laughed automatically. "Music creates atmosphere," she explained confidently toward him afterward publicly. The employee glanced around the room where customers already read peacefully beneath yellow lamps there emotionally somehow professionally. "The atmosphere already exists," he answered calmly afterward publicly. The influencer looked genuinely confused because Americans often believe environments require enhancement constantly somehow. She raised the speaker louder afterward while continuing narration for followers online, emotionally speaking. Nobody argued. Several readers simply stood and quietly walked elsewhere naturally. Eventually the employee unplugged a nearby outlet powering her equipment afterward there publicly emotionally. "Excuse me," she asked sharply while staring toward him automatically somehow. "People came here for books," he replied evenly. "Not your personality." That sentence froze the entire aisle, professionally speaking. Prague didn't compete against her energy afterward publicly. It removed the electricity feeding it naturally instead emotionally somehow. During a train ride near Zurich, an American father became furious because passengers boarded before his family finished organizing luggage publicly afterward there emotionally somehow. "Give people space," he snapped loudly while blocking the doorway accidentally. Nobody answered immediately, professionally speaking. A Swiss conductor simply pointed toward the platform clock afterward there calmly. "The train leaves according to time," he explained quietly. The father laughed automatically afterward publicly emotionally somehow. "So waiting 30 seconds kills the schedule?" The conductor checked his watch, professionally speaking. "Eventually, yes." That answer somehow offended him more deeply than anger would have naturally. He kept muttering afterward while dragging oversized suitcases through narrow aisles emotionally. Meanwhile, every passenger already sat silently watching mountains slide past windows professionally afterward there publicly somehow peacefully. Later the father complained toward me inside the dining carriage afterward there emotionally somehow. "These people care more about clocks than families," he whispered dramatically. A woman nearby finally looked up from her coffee, professionally speaking. Because clocks affect everyone equally, she answered softly, afterward publicly. The father opened his mouth confidently before realizing nobody aboard considered equality emotionally negotiable anymore, somehow naturally. American culture often treats inconvenience emotionally like proof systems should adapt, afterward publicly, somehow professionally. Europe frequently treats inconvenience instead as ordinary participation, socially speaking. That difference explains countless awkward travel moments naturally. Americans expect personal circumstances to reopen conversations automatically. Europeans usually assume conversations already ended when rules appeared printed publicly, afterward they're emotionally somehow. One side negotiates endlessly. The other already moved forward.
Listen please this story and write your comments. Thank you, friends.
Inside a museum near Vienna, I watched an American tourist ignore rope barriers surrounding medieval artifacts, afterward publicly, somehow emotionally. He stepped closer, photographing ancient jewelry through restricted areas, professionally speaking. A guard approached quietly, asking him to return behind the line naturally. The American laughed automatically, afterward there. Relax, I'm careful, he explained while leaning closer toward exposed displays, emotionally somehow. The guard studied him silently for several seconds, afterward publicly, professionally. That silence somehow felt medically cold, emotionally speaking. The barrier protects history from confidence, he finally answered quietly there naturally. Nearby tourists stopped walking completely, afterward somehow. The American forced another laugh automatically while stepping backward emotionally. Nobody else crossed the barrier again during the remaining tour, professionally speaking, publicly, afterward there. Later the tourist complained near the exit shop, afterward publicly, emotionally somehow. Europe acts like touching air damages civilization, he joked carefully. An elderly Austrian woman beside him replied softly, civilization usually gets damaged exactly that way. The American stopped smiling immediately, afterward there, professionally speaking. Vienna didn't punish him dramatically, naturally. It simply made him feel historically small, emotionally somehow, publicly. One evening in Amsterdam, an American bachelor party entered a tiny canal restaurant already half drunk, afterward publicly, emotionally somehow. They shouted greetings toward strangers automatically while dragging chairs across wooden floors, professionally speaking. The owner approached calmly, explaining reservations remained required after 7 naturally there. One man grinned confidently afterward. We're spending serious money tonight, he announced proudly toward everyone nearby, emotionally. The owner nodded once, afterward publicly, somehow professionally. Then spend it where tables exist. That sentence detonated across the room, emotionally speaking, naturally. The Americans laughed automatically, expecting negotiation afterward there. None arrived somehow. Meanwhile, couples continued eating quietly beneath candlelight, professionally. The owner simply waited beside the entrance, holding menus against his chest emotionally, until the group finally understood Amsterdam genuinely preferred peace over profit publicly. Outside, afterward publicly, emotionally somehow, one bachelor screamed that European hospitality sucked, professionally speaking. Nobody nearby reacted naturally there. Cyclists passed. Boats moved. Windows glowed above canals automatically, somehow peacefully. Finally another friend whispered carefully, "Bro, this city literally survived floods and wars. It's not collapsing because Chad couldn't reserve dinner." Even the bachelor started laughing afterward, emotionally publicly, somehow embarrassed. That's another hidden pattern across these stories, naturally afterward publicly somehow. Americans often assume money automatically purchases flexibility, emotionally speaking, professionally. Europe frequently disagrees completely. Businesses there sometimes protect atmosphere more aggressively than revenue socially afterward there. Americans expect customer satisfaction to dominate everything automatically. Europeans occasionally believe environments deserve protection from customers too emotionally somehow publicly. That philosophical difference creates endless beautiful disasters professionally. I once watched an American tourist enter a tiny village church in northern Spain wearing Bluetooth headphones afterward there publicly somehow emotionally. Music leaked softly while locals lit candles beneath painted ceilings, professionally speaking, naturally. A priest approached carefully, asking whether he could remove them automatically. The tourist smiled confidently afterward publicly. I'm still appreciating the architecture, he explained proudly toward everybody nearby emotionally somehow. The priest looked genuinely confused professionally speaking afterward there publicly. Then appreciate where you are, he answered calmly naturally somehow emotionally. The tourist laughed automatically before noticing absolutely nobody else inside found this interaction amusing afterward. Elderly women continued praying quietly beneath statues professionally. Candles flickered softly there. Suddenly the headphone seemed absurdly loud emotionally somehow publicly even though the volume barely changed naturally afterward. Outside afterward publicly emotionally somehow, the tourist defended himself automatically while buying postcards near the entrance professionally speaking. Back home churches welcome everyone, he insisted proudly. A woman beside him nodded once naturally there. We welcome everyone too, she replied carefully. We simply expect visitors to arrive mentally. That sentence followed him silently afterward through the village emotionally somehow professionally like church bells echoing publicly. At a public sauna in Helsinki, an American fitness coach became emotionally distressed because nobody spoke inside afterward publicly somehow professionally. He kept attempting motivational conversation automatically while pouring water over heated stones emotionally speaking. This place needs energy, he joked confidently toward strangers there naturally. A Finnish man finally looked directly at him afterward publicly. The energy is silence, he answered quietly somehow. The coach laughed automatically emotionally afterward publicly somehow. Silence isn't energy, brother. Nobody responded professionally speaking. Steam filled the room naturally there. Several minutes passed painfully afterward. Finally the Finnish man added calmly, exactly. That's why we protect it. The American suddenly looked trapped inside his own personality emotionally somehow publicly. Helsinki never demanded quiet aggressively. Everyone else simply stopped feeding his noise professionally.
What do you think about this? Write please your comments and subscribe on my channel.
Americans abroad often expect visible resistance afterward publicly emotionally somehow professionally. They understand arguments, complaints, negotiations, emotional escalation naturally. Europe frequently responds through absence instead there somehow. No applause. No engagement. No adjustment automatically afterward publicly. People simply continue existing without emotionally validating disruptive behavior professionally speaking. For Americans raised inside customer-first culture, indifference feels strangely supernatural socially afterward there somehow emotionally. During a ferry ride near Oslo, an American tourist became convinced staff ignored him intentionally afterward publicly emotionally somehow. He repeatedly snapped fingers requesting additional ketchup packets professionally speaking naturally. The employee finally approached calmly there. Please stop doing that, she explained quietly afterward somehow. The American looked shocked automatically emotionally. Doing what? He asked confidently while snapping again beside crowded passengers publicly afterward. The employee stared directly toward him afterward there publicly somehow professionally. Calling humans like pets. Several nearby passengers immediately stopped eating emotionally speaking naturally. The American laughed automatically afterward. It's just ketchup. The employee nodded once calmly. Exactly, she replied. Which makes this behavior even stranger. Nobody clapped. Nobody argued. Yet somehow the entire ferry emotionally shifted away from him publicly afterward there professionally. For the remaining ride afterward publicly emotionally somehow, he avoided eye contact completely automatically. Children watched seagulls nearby professionally speaking. Coffee cups rattled gently there naturally. Norway never humiliated him aggressively somehow. It simply transformed ordinary manners into a mirror showing how absurd he suddenly appeared publicly afterward emotionally. That quiet reflection hurt more than shouting probably would have naturally professionally speaking. Inside a historic cafe in Paris, an American businessman opened his laptop beside tiny breakfast tables afterward publicly emotionally somehow. He immediately joined a loud video meeting professionally speaking naturally. Corporate phrases bounced across the room automatically while customers read newspapers quietly nearby there. A waiter approached carefully afterward. "Monsieur, no calls inside," he explained calmly while gesturing toward the terrace emotionally somehow publicly. The businessman covered his microphone afterward publicly emotionally somehow. "This meeting runs a billion-dollar project," he whispered dramatically professionally speaking. The waiter nodded naturally there. "Then continue it outside." Several customers nearly smiled afterward automatically somehow. The businessman stared around expecting sympathy emotionally. None arrived publicly. Paris protected coffee conversations more seriously than executive self-importance professionally speaking naturally afterward there somehow. Later the businessman complained outside while balancing espresso beside rainy sidewalks emotionally afterward publicly somehow professionally. "This continent hates productivity," he muttered automatically. A smoker nearby laughed quietly naturally there. "No," she replied carefully. "We just separate work from breathing." The businessman looked toward glowing cafe windows afterward emotionally somehow. Inside, nobody seemed impressed by urgency anymore publicly professionally speaking. Paris continued peacefully without him.
Near Edinburgh Castle, I watched an American tourist argue with a street violinist afterward publicly emotionally somehow. The tourist insisted the musician should perform something recognizable, professionally speaking naturally there. "Play movie soundtracks," he suggested confidently, while dropping coins dramatically afterward automatically. The violinist finished his piece calmly somehow before answering quietly. "I already played something recognizable." Scotland recognized it emotionally. The tourist laughed awkwardly afterward publicly somehow emotionally. "Yeah, but tourists don't know that music." The violinist adjusted his bow professionally speaking naturally there. "Then tourists learned something today." Nearby listeners almost applauded automatically afterward. The American stood frozen somehow, because education clearly wasn't the response he expected emotionally publicly. Edinburgh protected its culture without advertising it professionally speaking afterward naturally. As evening settled afterward publicly emotionally somehow, I realized every story followed identical invisible mechanics professionally speaking naturally. Americans entered spaces expecting participation, customization, reassurance, attention automatically. Europe offered structure instead there somehow. Not cruelty, not hatred emotionally. Just boundaries continuing quietly without apology, publicly afterward professionally. That calm refusal unsettles tourists because confidence survives arguments easily. Indifference destroys it almost immediately somehow naturally. Travel exposes assumptions people never notice back home afterward publicly emotionally, somehow professionally. Americans often discover their confidence depends heavily on systems reacting predictably naturally there. Europe occasionally refuses the reaction itself automatically afterward. No escalation, no accommodation, no emotional performance somehow publicly. Just environments continuing peacefully without rearranging themselves around one loud visitor emotionally speaking professionally. That silence becomes the real culture shock eventually.
My dear friends, did you like these stories? If so, like and write in the comments what topics you would like to hear the next stories on. Thank you. Bye bye.